Have you ever wondered what sustained the strength of the prophets of the Old Testament on their solitary journeys through the desert? How did they remain steadfast in the face of extreme challenges with a diet that, by today's standards, might seem surprisingly different? Elijah, Elisha, and John the Baptist are known for their missions, but few know what these prophets consumed to maintain their energy and endurance. In this video, we will delve into the main foods that the prophets consumed throughout their day. First, locusts. John the Baptist, known for his austere and faith-driven lifestyle, lived in the desert and ate in a way that was unusual for the time, consuming locusts as described in the New Testament. According to Jewish tradition, locusts were one of the few insects permitted for human consumption, as established in Leviticus 11:22. John ate these insects, something surprising to many, but common among desert nomads who needed to adapt their diet to limited resources. Locusts were gathered and prepared practically, often dried or lightly cooked to make them easier to consume. This type of diet was rich in nutrients, helping John the Baptist sustain his preaching routine in the desert. Locusts are high in protein and contain essential vitamins and minerals such as iron and calcium, which are particularly valuable in environments where access to a variety of foods was scarce. With these insects, John the Baptist obtained the energy needed for his long journeys and demanding life in the desert, adapting to a place where almost nothing could be planted or harvested. This food provided him with strength for his daily activities and was easy to store and transport. Locusts, which could be collected during times of abundance in the desert, were also known for their resilience and ability to reproduce in large numbers, making them a reliable resource for the local population. In John the Baptist's case, they were a trustworthy source of sustenance in a place where food was limited. He gathered them in swarms, embracing the simplicity and abundance the environment offered him. To many of his followers, John's consumption of such a humble and accessible food showed his detachment from material indulgences and reinforced the image of a man wholly devoted to his divine purpose. John the Baptist spent much of his life preaching and calling people to repentance. During these periods of intense activity, he chose a diet that did not distract him from his mission. Locusts, being accessible and highly nutritious, complemented his diet without requiring much preparation, keeping him focused on his preaching. Moreover, eating these insects highlighted his independent and reclusive lifestyle. He was not dependent on cities or local markets, but on what he found around him, living with minimal reliance on material goods. To consume the locusts, John the Baptist likely dried them in the sun or lightly cooked them over an improvised fire. This method of preparation allowed him to preserve the nutrients and natural flavor of the insects, making them ready for quick and easy consumption. Many Bedouins and nomadic tribes used the same practice, carrying these small snacks on their journeys through the desert. Thus, John the Baptist followed a way of life adapted to harsh conditions that provided him with the sustenance necessary to continue his journey. This type of diet allowed John the Baptist to remain in the desert, far from the distractions of city life, and focused on his prophetic calling. Like the other prophets, he depended on what the harsh environment offered him, living in line with the simplicity he preached. John's diet, centered on locusts, was just one more aspect of his austere life, of total focus and commitment to the mission of preparing the way for the one who would come after him. Second, barley bread. Barley bread was a fundamental food in the ancient Israelite diet, especially in the arid context where many prophets lived. Barley, a grain hardy enough to withstand desert conditions, grew even in poorer soils with limited water resources, becoming a daily source of sustenance. In regions like the desert where Elijah spent much of his journey, this simple bread, prepared with crushed barley grains mixed with water, sustained the humbler population of Israel. The prophets, accustomed to a life of frugality, depended on it not only for its simplicity but for its constant availability. Baked on hot stones or in rudimentary ovens, the bread was consumed throughout the day, a common and essential resource for everyone. During a grueling and dangerous journey, when the prophet Elijah fled from Jezebel, he rested in the desert, as narrated in 1 Kings 19:6. Exhausted and out of strength, he fell asleep under a tree, where he was surprised by an angel sent by God. Upon waking, he found a bread baked over coals and a jar of water beside his head. The barley bread, offered by the angel, was the only food Elijah received to face the desert and strengthen himself to continue his journey. In a setting dominated by hunger and thirst, this simple bread became true sustenance for survival. It was enough to keep going, despite the difficulties and hostile environment. The Israelites also used barley bread as a base in their meals, pairing it with vegetables, olive oil, or water when available. The prophets, often traveling or living in isolation, carried compact loaves wrapped in cloths to preserve them and consume them throughout the day. Bread became a companion on the journey, a lightweight and practical item that could be easily carried. Farmers, mostly simple rural men, harvested and prepared barley during the dry season. They organized themselves in communities to tend to the fields and ensure that sustenance would be shared with those unable to harvest or produce their own bread, including prophets and travelers. The multiplication of bread appears in several passages, with barley being the grain multiplied in critical moments. In one of these instances, during a widespread famine, the prophet Elisha instructed his servant to distribute the little barley bread he had among the hungry people. Although it was a modest amount, everyone was able to eat, and there was food left over. This event, recounted in 2 Kings 4:42-44, exemplifies the importance of barley bread to meet needs in times of scarcity, as it was a common food that, while simple, fed large numbers of people in extreme situations. The ease of preparation and the bread's durability made it the best option for those facing the hardships of the desert. The preparation of barley bread was traditional and made with basic utensils. After harvesting and drying the grain, the Israelites would grind it in rudimentary mills and mix the flour with water, forming a dough. This dough was then placed on heated stones or in makeshift clay ovens. For the prophets who lived between villages and uninhabited areas, barley bread was even more valuable, as they depended on it to survive without needing to return constantly to populated areas. The bread, often hard and unleavened, was stored in clay jars to keep it from spoiling, ensuring a stock for longer journeys and travels. Third, wild honey, the prophet's natural sweetener. John the Baptist, in addition to locusts, also included wild honey in his diet, a natural and accessible delicacy in the desert environments where he lived and preached. This honey was found in hives hidden in rock crevices and trees, where bees took shelter away from human activity. In the desert, wild honey served as a quick source of energy and sweetness, along with its nutritional properties, which complemented John's diet. For him, this food provided a perfect balance with the locusts, adding calories and essential nutrients for his daily activities. Biblical culture always considered honey a symbol of prosperity and blessing. In the Old Testament, the land flowing with milk and honey describes the abundance and generosity of divine promise. Wild honey was a valued food, accessible only to those who ventured into more arid and mountainous regions to gather from hives what the bees produced. By including honey in his diet, John the Baptist followed the tradition of many Israelites who saw this natural sweetener as a source of health and strength. Besides providing energy, honey offered a refreshing relief amid the heat and aridity of the desert. To gather the honey, John likely had to find and carefully remove pieces of the hive, often using sticks or improvising tools. Although risky, this process was common among the peoples of the time who lived in desert areas. Once obtained, the honey was consumed directly or stored in small containers to facilitate transport. With its sweet taste and thick texture, it provided quick energy, making it a food that could be consumed in small amounts but with a big effect. Honey also had healing properties and was used as a natural remedy among ancient peoples. In John the Baptist's time, it might have been applied to wounds or used to soothe his throat after long desert sermons. Its soothing and antiseptic effect made it an ally for health, especially useful in environments where access to care was limited. This property made honey more than just food. It was a therapeutic resource, known and valued among the prophets who were constantly exposed to the hostile environment and its demands. With his focus on his divine calling, John the Baptist had in this food a source of sustenance that kept him energized and prepared for intense spiritual work. By consuming honey, he fortified himself to carry out the mission of delivering his message to all who came to hear him. Each spoonful of this natural sweetener carried an essential energy load, enabling him to continue preaching and moving without needing to rely on external food sources. Fourth, bitter herbs. Bitter herbs always played an important role in Jewish tradition, especially in ritual moments such as Passover. Used in celebrations to recall the suffering and liberation of the Hebrew people, these herbs were also found in the diet of many Old Testament prophets. Herbs like chicory, wild lettuce, and other native plants not only offered essential nutrients in times of scarcity, but also carried profound symbolism. For the prophets, each portion of bitter herbs recalled the hardships and trials of their calling, serving as a constant reminder of the hardships and the path of renunciation they followed. In the case of Passover, for example, bitter herbs were eaten with unleavened bread and lamb, in a meal symbolizing the haste and suffering of the people of Israel during the Exodus from Egypt. This act was maintained with great reverence and meaning, representing both the bitterness of slavery and gratitude for the freedom gained. For prophets living away from cities, bitter herbs were an easy food to integrate into their daily lives. The wild plants found in the arid lands and mountainsides were easy to gather and did not require cultivation, allowing the prophets to remain distanced from urban dependencies. Many of these plants had medicinal properties and could be used to treat minor aches and discomforts, which was particularly useful for those leading a life of constant travel and physical challenges. Prophets, who traversed desert regions and embraced isolation, relied on these foods not only for nutrition but also for health maintenance. These herbs, though bitter to the palate, offered bodily strength and relief for aches and pains, fortifying them to face the arduous path of their mission. The bitter herbs also symbolized a commitment to simplicity and the renunciation of a life of luxury. Among the prophets, the consumption of these foods was an exercise in humility and discipline, reinforcing the idea that their journey did not include excessive comforts. For men like Elijah and Elisha, who frequently confronted kings and hostile crowds, this food symbolized preparation for times of trial. They turned their meals into a rite of devotion, accepting bitterness as part of the prophetic mission. Thus, these herbs accompanied them not only for nutrition, but for the symbolism of renunciation and perseverance they carried. Preparing these herbs was simple. In some cases, they were boiled in water and eaten as a rustic broth or porridge. In others, they were chewed fresh straight from the soil where they grew. The bitter herbs offered a feeling of fullness without burdening the body, allowing prophets to continue their activities with vigor and endurance. The fiber and bitter components also aided digestion, important in a simple and frugal diet like that of the prophets, where each food served a practical function and there was no room for excess or waste. Fifth, olive oil. Olive oil was one of the main elements in the diet and culture of the Old Testament peoples, including the prophets. This oil, extracted from olives through traditional methods, involved crushing the fruits in stone mills and collecting the oil in clay containers. With a golden color and strong flavor, olive oil was highly valued not only for its nutritional value, but also for its central role in Israel's sacred rituals. For prophets who frequently lived in arid conditions and depended on simple foods, olive oil was a source of healthy fat and energy, essential for facing the challenging routine and long journeys. In addition to providing nutrition, olive oil was widely used as seasoning and an ingredient in basic preparations, such as breads and porridges. It also had a special place in communal meals, being a precious item at banquets and celebrations. In biblical texts, olive oil appears in various passages, used both for cooking and in offerings to God. During sacrifices and ceremonies, it was poured over altars and included in grain offerings, highlighting its function as a symbol of blessing and purity. For prophets, this oil represented a connection to the divine, used to anoint kings and prophets, strengthening the spiritual bond and preparing them for their missions. Olive oil also had an important medicinal use, as it was applied to wounds to aid in healing and in massages to relieve muscle pain, a valuable resource for those who walked long distances or faced the desert. When prophets turned to olive oil to meet their physical needs, they also saw it as a divine gift that helped them maintain their health under adverse conditions. In purification rituals, the oil was applied to the skin or mixed with herbs, serving as a purifying and protective agent. Thus, olive oil was more than just food. It was a type of medicine, a precious good that sustained both the body and the spirit. For people like Elijah and Elisha, olive oil was considered a valuable resource that could be stored in sealed containers for months without losing its properties. This made it one of the safest and most practical products for those living in isolated environments. Additionally, the oil could be traded and distributed as a valuable item, accepted as payment or offering in times of need. In the house of the widow of Zarephath, for instance, the miracle of the multiplication of oil performed by Elijah demonstrates the importance of this resource for survival, as it provided not only sustenance, but a means to provide for the family. Prophets saw olive oil as a sacred element worthy of respect. Before any journey, the oil could be used to anoint the head as a symbol of protection and strength. When sent on difficult missions, the prophets carried with them the reminder that this oil was more than food. It was a means of communion with God, who accompanied them every step of the way. This act of anointing, widely mentioned in the scriptures, had a renewing effect and was practiced by both kings and common people, representing protection, healing, and blessing for the road ahead. Sixth, figs and dates. Figs and dates were among the most consumed fruits in the region where the prophets of the Old Testament lived. These fruits were easily found and played an important role in biblical nutrition, both for their nutritional value and for their durability. Figs, for example, grew abundantly on native fig trees, which adapted well to the hot and dry climate. They could be eaten fresh or dried in the sun, a method that increased their durability and concentrated their sugars, making them a long-lasting energy source for desert journeys. This fruit was essential in the diet of prophets, as it provided quick and accessible energy to sustain their long walks and activities. Dates, on the other hand, came from date palm trees, common in regions like the Jordan Valley. These fruits were rich in natural sugars and fiber, helping provide satiety and vigor. Because they were easy to transport, dates became ideal companions for prophets who crossed desert or mountainous areas. They could be carried in small leather pouches or clay containers, always ready to be consumed in moments of hunger or fatigue. During long and tiring journeys, these fruits were chewed slowly, offering sweetness and energy as the prophets continued their missions. Dates also had deep cultural and spiritual significance. In various biblical passages, they symbolize prosperity and fertility, mentioned as part of the land flowing with milk and honey, a reference to the abundance God promised to the people of Israel. When consumed, these fruits reminded prophets of the fertile land that God had granted to his people. The fact that they were always accessible in the regions where they lived reinforced the idea that divine providence cared for all needs, even the simplest ones. Thus, both figs and dates were not just food. They were symbols of blessing and abundance. When prophets encountered figs and dates on their journeys, they knew these foods could substitute for more complex meals. Just a few dried figs or dates were enough to guarantee the energy needed for the next destination. The fruits also served as food to share, allowing prophets to offer a bit of sweetness and energy to anyone who joined them, strengthening the bond of fellowship amid the arid desert. Additionally, they could be used to prepare pastes or simple snacks, combining them with nuts or honey. Seventh, manna, described in the scriptures as the bread from heaven, was a miraculous provision sent by God to feed the people of Israel during their 40-year journey in the desert. This food appeared as a type of seed covering the ground in the early hours of the day, similar to dew, and had to be collected at dawn. Its appearance was compared to coriander seed, white in color and with a mildly sweet flavor, like a honey cake. This daily sustenance became essential for the Israelites, including their leaders and prophets, who needed divine provision to survive amid the arid desert landscape. The manna had specific instructions for its use. It had to be gathered daily, an exact portion for each person, and could not be stored overnight, as it would spoil. Only on the eve of the Sabbath was it allowed to store an additional amount, so that people could respect the day of rest without needing to gather food. This daily miracle taught the Israelites to depend on God continuously, trusting that sustenance would be provided each new day. For prophets and leaders, manna represented a constant sign of divine presence and faithfulness, a reminder that provision would come in exact measure, according to each one's needs. In addition to its nutritional value, manna carried profound spiritual symbolism. Moses himself, in instructing the people, emphasized that manna was a gift from God to teach that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord, Deuteronomy 8:3. This miraculous food highlighted the direct relationship between physical sustenance and trust in the divine, reminding people that each meal came from God's hand. For prophets and priests, Manna served as a lesson in humility and dependence as they consumed this daily food, reinforcing the practice of trusting God entirely for each new stage. Throughout the journey in the desert, manna was the primary source of energy and strength for the Israelites and their leaders. It met all basic nutritional needs, enabling the people to endure the harsh desert climate and the long trek to the Promised Land. For prophets who often led or guided the people, manna was a reminder that the success of their mission depended entirely on God's faithfulness. They ate this food and led the people, aware that they were sustained by a supernatural provision that transcended the natural resources available in the desert. The preservation of a pot of manna inside the Ark of the Covenant underscored its sacred value and the importance of its story for future generations. According to the book of Exodus, God instructed Moses to store a container of manna as a perpetual testimony of divine care. This sample remained in the Holy of Holies, representing the covenant between God and Israel, that he would never abandon his people and would always provide for their needs. For prophets and priests, the manna kept in the ark served as a constant reminder of the covenant between God and Israel, that he would never abandon his people and would always provide for their needs. The prophet's diet consisted of simple foods, but each carried profound meaning, reflecting the life of faith and discipline they led. Barley bread, wild honey, bitter herbs, olive oil, figs, dates, water, and even manna were more than sources of nutrition. They symbolized the spiritual journey and dependence on God. These foods, which for many were ordinary, served the prophets as constant reminders that simplicity had a special power, sustaining both body and soul. Their meals reflected a life of humility and surrender, where essentials were enough to sustain both the physical and the spiritual. The example of these foods, humble, simple, and meaningful, reveals that true sustenance is not found in abundance, but in what truly meets the needs of the soul. For those who followed the path of faith, each food consumed was a step toward a life closer to God, where essentials became sufficient. Now that we have explored the foods that sustained the prophets of the Old Testament, it raises the question, how might this simplicity and depth in food inspire our lives today? After all, Elijah, Elisha, and other great prophets found strength and purpose in basic foods, far from extravagance. Perhaps these foods, which seem so distant from our daily lives, can remind us that essentials are often all we need. Have we become so accustomed to modern abundance that we have forgotten the value of simple things? What would it be like to experience a deeper connection with what nourishes us, both body and soul? And what if we tried to reclaim a bit of this prophetic diet, seeking humility and gratitude in each meal? If you want to discover more about these practices that can transform our perspective on what we eat, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to keep learning about what the Bible can teach us, not just about the body, but about life itself. And don't forget to like the video to help us bring more content like this. Your support is invaluable. We'll see you in the next video.